Well, who else? Well, that's it.
Burt Lancaster was more than just a movie star. He was a towering presence in Hollywood, a man whose smile could light up a theater, yet whose temper could darken an entire film set. To millions of fans around the world, he was the epitome of charisma, strength, and classic movie glamour. But to those who worked closest with him, Burt was something else entirely, demanding, uncompromising, and, at times, ruthless. He was a man who lived for control, whether in front of the camera or behind it. And like all men who rise to the top, Lancaster made his share of enemies. He fought with directors, clashed with co-stars, and even alienated studio executives who once saw him as Hollywood's golden boy. Yet among the many rivals and grudges that filled his long career, there was one man who stood out above the rest. One actor who was both his equal and his opposite. One man he admired, envied, and ultimately resented. That man was Kirk Douglas. Their relationship was unlike anything Hollywood had seen before. On screen, they were often cast as partners, rivals, or brothers in arms. Their chemistry undeniable, their energy electric. But off-screen, what simmered between them was a cocktail of jealousy, ego, and suppressed rage. Burt Lancaster truly hated Kirk Douglas more than anyone else, and the reasons why reveal a side of Lancaster that few fans ever knew. Long before he became the face of Hollywood stardom, Burt Lancaster was just another boy from East Harlem, New York. Born in 1913 to working-class parents of Irish descent, his childhood was marked by both hardship and discipline. His father, a postman, demanded order and respect. His mother, deeply religious, instilled in him a sense of moral duty. But young Burt had a restless energy that couldn't be contained. As a teenager, he discovered his love for athletics. Towering at over 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and piercing blue eyes, he seemed destined for a life outside the ordinary. Sports became his outlet, but it was the circus that captured his imagination. Lancaster joined a traveling circus as an acrobat, mastering balance, strength, and precision. Those early years swinging on trapezes and performing daring stunts would shape not only his body, but also his sense of discipline and showmanship. He wasn't just another strong man. He was a performer, and he knew how to command an audience. The circus also taught him resilience, traveling from town to town, sleeping in cramped quarters, performing through injury and exhaustion. It gave him the toughness he would later bring into Hollywood. He was no stranger to pain, no stranger to struggle. And when the circus life ended, it was that toughness that carried him forward. World War II interrupted Lancaster's performing career, and like many men of his generation, he enlisted, serving in the U.S. Army. After the war, he tried his hand at acting, almost by accident. A chance meeting with a casting agent opened the door to Broadway, and soon after, Hollywood came calling. His breakout came in 1946 with The Killers, a dark film noir that showcased not just his physical presence, but also his brooding intensity. Audiences were captivated by this new kind of leading man, rugged, athletic, and unpredictable. He wasn't polished like Cary Grant, nor suave like Clark Gable. He was raw, explosive, and dangerous. And Hollywood loved it. By the early 1950s, Burt Lancaster had become one of the industry's most bankable stars. Films like From Here to Eternity cemented his place in Hollywood history. He won an Academy Award for Elmer Gantry in 1960, proving he wasn't just a muscular presence but also a serious actor capable of depth and nuance. But Lancaster wasn't satisfied with just being a star. He craved control. Unlike many actors of his era who depended on studios to dictate their careers, Lancaster wanted power over his projects. Along with Harold Hecht and James Hill, he formed the production company Hecht Hill Lancaster, giving him a level of independence few actors had at the time. This was a revolutionary move in Hollywood. At a time when most stars were still tied to restrictive studio contracts, Lancaster was choosing his own roles, producing his own films, and shaping his own image. It was both a bold act of defiance and a declaration of ambition. He was no longer just an actor for hire. He was a force to be reckoned with, yet with power came problems. Lancaster's perfectionism made him notoriously difficult to work with. On set, he demanded excellence not only from himself but from everyone around him. Directors who failed to meet his expectations often felt the brunt of his wrath. Co-stars who didn't deliver their lines with conviction were met with cold disdain. Crew members whispered about his temper, about how he could charm in one moment and explode in the next. Still, his undeniable talent kept him in demand. Audiences adored him, critics respected him, and producers, though wary of his temperament, couldn't argue with his box office draw. Lancaster had carved a place for himself in Hollywood as both a leading man and a powerful figure behind the scenes. But even as he reached the peak of his career, cracks began to show in his relationships. His relentless drive made him enemies in an industry built on fragile egos. Some resented his independence, others his arrogance. But perhaps the most dangerous enemy of all was not someone he openly fought with, but someone who reflected his own strengths, his own flaws, and his own hunger for dominance. That man was Kirk Douglas. Douglas, like Lancaster, was a self-made star. He too came from humble beginnings, clawed his way into Hollywood, and refused to play by the old studio rules. He too was ambitious, driven, and unwilling to settle for second place. And when two men with such forceful personalities collided, sparks were inevitable. By the time Lancaster and Douglas first crossed paths in the late 1940s, both were rising stars. Their paths would soon intertwine in ways neither could have predicted. On screen, they would be cast as allies and rivals, their chemistry undeniable. Off-screen, however, their relationship would become one of the most complicated rivalries in Hollywood history. But before that rivalry could fully ignite, Lancaster had to first establish himself as a man who wouldn't back down, not to studios, not to directors, and certainly not to co-stars. It was this iron will that made him a star, but it was also the same iron will that made him incapable of tolerating another man's success. And in Kirk Douglas, Burt Lancaster saw both a mirror and a Burt Lancaster's rise to fame had been meteoric, but the higher he climbed, the more apparent his darker traits became. Hollywood was filled with strong personalities, but few actors carried themselves with the kind of intimidating authority that Lancaster projected both on and off the screen. To directors, he was a challenge. To producers, he was a gamble. To co-stars, he was often a storm waiting to break. And yet, his undeniable brilliance made him impossible to ignore. From the beginning, Lancaster's reputation preceded him. He was not content to simply show up, deliver his lines, and collect his paycheck. He wanted to be involved in every aspect of a production: the script, the casting, the staging, even the editing. To him, filmmaking wasn't just about performance. It was about vision. And if the director's vision clashed with his own, Lancaster wasn't afraid to let his feelings be known. Stories from his sets became the stuff of legend. Directors who tried to rein him in often found themselves in shouting matches that could last for hours. Lancaster, tall and imposing, would tower over them, his voice booming, his eyes flashing with barely restrained anger. Some called it passion. Others called it arrogance. Either way, few walked away unscathed. Take his 1952 film, The Crimson Pirate. On screen, it was a light-hearted swashbuckler, with Lancaster swinging from ropes, performing his own stunts, and charming audiences with his grin. But behind the scenes, the mood was far less jovial. Lancaster clashed repeatedly with the director, complaining about shot setups, dialogue, and pacing. Crew members whispered that the set felt less like a film shoot and more like a battlefield, with Lancaster constantly asserting himself as the true captain of the ship. And then there was From Here to Eternity, the film that would forever cement his legacy with the iconic beach scene opposite Deborah Kerr. While audiences swooned, those on set remembered Lancaster's intensity. He pushed not only himself, but everyone around him, demanding retakes until he was satisfied. Director Fred Zinnemann admired Lancaster's dedication, but also admitted that working with him was exhausting. "Burt gave everything," he once said, "but he expected everything in return, and more." This relentless pursuit of perfection extended to his fellow actors. If a co-star didn't rise to his level, Lancaster's patience quickly ran out. He had no problem humiliating others on set if he felt their work wasn't up to standard. To him, mediocrity was unacceptable, and while this earned him respect from some who admired his commitment, it also bred resentment. Many actors dreaded being cast alongside him, knowing that every scene would be a battle for dominance. Yet, Lancaster was not entirely without charm. He could be magnetic when he wanted to be, capable of winning over journalists, producers, and fans with that famous smile. But underneath the charm lurked a competitive fire that never dimmed. He had to be the best, the strongest, the most memorable, and when someone threatened that position, the results were explosive. It was during this period, at the height of his fame, that his relationship with Kirk Douglas began to take shape. Both men were cut from similar cloth, ambitious, self-made, and unwilling to bend. Hollywood was not big enough for two egos of that magnitude, and yet, fate kept throwing them together. Their first major collaboration, I Walk Alone in 1947, set the tone for what was to come. Lancaster played the hardened ex-con, while Douglas portrayed the slick nightclub owner who betrayed him. On screen, their rivalry crackled with authenticity. Audiences were enthralled by the intensity between the two men, though few realized just how much of that tension was real. Behind the camera, Lancaster and Douglas sized each other up like prize-fighters before a match. Both were determined not to be overshadowed. Both believed they were the true star of the picture. And while the film was a success, it marked the beginning of a decades-long tug-of-war for dominance. As Lancaster's career continued, so did the stories of his volatility. He famously argued with director John Frankenheimer during the filming of Birdman of Alcatraz, pushing back against nearly every creative decision. At one point, Lancaster even threatened to shut down the production unless changes were made to his liking. Frankenheimer later admitted that working with Lancaster was one of the most challenging experiences of his career, though he also conceded that Lancaster's instincts often elevated the final product. This was the paradox of Burt Lancaster. He was difficult, demanding, and often abrasive, but he was also brilliant. His instincts were sharp, his work ethic unmatched. More often than not, his battles on set resulted in films that stood the test of time. And so, while directors and actors cursed his name behind closed doors, they couldn't deny the results. Lancaster delivered, and in Hollywood, results were everything. Still, his behavior left scars. Fellow actors described him as cold, distant, and unwilling to form genuine friendships. He was professional to a fault, keeping his emotions tightly controlled, except when they erupted in bursts of anger. Some wondered if his background as an acrobat, with its demands for precision and control, had shaped him into a man who could never tolerate weakness, in himself or others. Kirk Douglas, however, was different. Where others backed down from Lancaster's intensity, Douglas pushed back. He was equally fiery, equally ambitious, and equally determined to leave his mark. If Lancaster barked, Douglas barked louder. If Lancaster tried to dominate a scene, Douglas found a way to steal, and the two men were mirrors of each other, and mirrors rarely reflect kindly. Their clashes were not always open warfare. Often, they played out in subtle ways, through competitiveness, through one-upmanship, through an unspoken battle for the spotlight. On set, this made their performances electric. Off set, it made their relationship volatile. By the late 1950s, their rivalry had become Hollywood legend. Directors who worked with them together often described it as both exhilarating and exhausting. The chemistry they created on screen was undeniable, but behind the scenes, it was a constant balancing act. Each man wanted the upper hand, and neither was willing to give ground. Yet despite their animosity, they kept being cast together. Studios recognized the box office magic of their pairing. Audiences loved the tension, the spark, the sense that these two men truly despised each other, because in many ways they did. And so, Hollywood kept feeding the fire, placing them side by side in film after film, until their feud became one of the most talked about rivalries in the industry. But beneath all the shouting matches and competitive games, something deeper was brewing in Burt Lancaster. He could accept clashing with directors. He could tolerate falling out with co-stars. But when it came to Kirk Douglas, the rivalry cut to the core of who he was. It wasn't just about ego. It wasn't just about control. It was about fear. Fear that no matter how hard he worked, no matter how much he achieved, Kirk Douglas might always be one step ahead. This fear would follow Lancaster throughout his career, shaping not only his reputation but also his relationships. And as time went on, the hatred he felt for Douglas would become less about rivalry and more about obsession. In Hollywood, Burt Lancaster had many enemies, but only one man lived rent-free in his mind. Only one man could ignite his temper like no other, and only one man could draw out the very worst, and perhaps the very best, in him. That man was Kirk Douglas. Burt Lancaster's career was filled with rivalries, clashes, and combustible egos, but no relationship defined him more than his long and complicated bond with Kirk Douglas. To outsiders, they were Hollywood's ultimate duo, two rugged, self-made stars who looked unstoppable when they shared the screen. Together, they brought in audiences, elevated films, and created performances that are still studied to this day. But beneath the surface of that partnership lay a rivalry so fierce that it often spilled into outright hatred. And for Lancaster, Kirk Douglas became the one man he could never forgive. Their story began in the late 1940s, when both men were rising stars in post-war Hollywood. Lancaster, with his athletic build and commanding presence, had already made an impact with the Killers. Douglas, on the other hand, was building a reputation as a fiery, intense actor with his breakout role in Champion. Both men had clawed their way out of humble beginnings. Lancaster from East Harlem, Douglas from the rough streets of New York as the son of poor Russian Jewish immigrants. Both were outsiders, and both had something to prove. From the very beginning, their similarities created sparks. When they first worked together on I Walk Alone in 1947, the rivalry ignited. Lancaster played Frankie Madison, the ex-con who returns, to confront his old friend played by Douglas, who betrayed him. The chemistry between them was undeniable. Every glare, every sharp exchange of dialogue felt charged with real hostility. Audiences were hooked, believing they were witnessing two actors playing their roles. But the truth was that much of that tension came from reality. Lancaster and Douglas were competitive in every sense of the word. Who got the better lines? Who got the close-ups? Who stood taller in the frame? These were not small details to them. They were battles for dominance. Director Byron Haskin later recalled, "It was like refereeing two bulls in a ring. Both wanted to be seen as the stronger one." Over the years, that competition only grew more intense. In the 1957 classic Gunfight, at the OK Corral, Lancaster played Wyatt Earp, while Douglas portrayed the unpredictable Doc Holliday. On screen, their characters were uneasy allies, a reflection of their real-life relationship. Lancaster, calm and stoic, represented control and authority. Douglas, fiery and impulsive, brought a wild unpredictability that threatened to steal the show. Critics praised the film as one of the finest westerns of its era, but behind the scenes, the feud simmered. Douglas would later admit in his autobiography, The Ragman's Son, that their relationship was both collaborative and combative. He wrote, "Burt and I were the perfect match, and the worst enemies. He was tall, handsome, and physically imposing. I was intense, aggressive, and fiery. He needed me, and I needed him. But we never stopped competing." Lancaster, for his part, was less charitable in private. Friends recalled him often dismissing Douglas as short, pushy and egotistical. For a man like Lancaster, who valued physical dominance and presence, Douglas's smaller stature was something he couldn't resist mocking. But it wasn't Douglas's height that made him dangerous. It was his ferocity. Douglas had a way of stealing the spotlight, even when the role wasn't meant to be his. And that infuriated Lancaster. The rivalry wasn't just professional. Their personal lives also intersected in ways that fueled resentment. Both men were notorious womanizers, their names often linked with glamorous actresses and models. Rumors swirled that they pursued the same women on more than one occasion, leading to awkward confrontations and lasting bitterness. Neither man liked to lose, not in the box office, not on the set, and certainly not in love. Their competition extended to power within Hollywood as well. Both became producers, both fought for control over their projects, and both were determined to carve out legacies beyond acting. Lancaster's company, Hecht Hill Lancaster, produced a string of hits in the 1950s, giving him enormous influence. Douglas, not to be outdone, founded his own company, Bryna Productions, named after his mother. Through Bryna, Douglas produced Paths of Glory with a young Stanley Kubrick, a film that cemented his reputation as a serious artist willing to take risks. Each man watched the other's moves carefully, never wanting to be left behind. If Lancaster won an Oscar, Douglas wanted one too. If Douglas took on a daring role, Lancaster sought something bigger. Their careers became a chess game, with each trying to outmaneuver the other. Perhaps the most telling example of their rivalry came with the 1964 political thriller, 7 Days in May. Lancaster played a general plotting a coup against the U.S. president, portrayed by Douglas. The tension between their characters mirrored the tension between the actors themselves. Douglas later recalled, "When Burt glared at me in that film, he wasn't just acting. He meant it." On the surface, the two maintained a veneer of friendship. They appeared together at premieres, gave interviews praising each other's talents, and allowed the studios to market them as a dynamic duo. But behind closed doors, they were constantly at war. Lancaster once said privately, "I respect Kirk, but I can't stand him."